Welcome back to another session of this podcast. My name is Cristian Servín, and I want to thank all of you who have been who are right now in the chat and online. I want to thank all the participants who are here today in the Hackers Notepads. I'm very happy to see a couple of my old colleagues here and participating. I received a very nice number of people who were interested in this podcast. And I just want to let you know that the whole idea of this podcast that we create is to help you or to help the community to understand concepts in computing, right? Not only in computer science, but in the aspect of computing in general. And one of the ideas behind the purpose of this podcast is to bring the contextualization of the ideas of computing and computer science in multidisciplinary areas. For example, today we have a special guest that she is an analytical philosopher. She's philosopher hardcore. So I'm very happy to have Crisol Escobedo here today. And we're going to talk about a couple of ideas that we generate a couple of years ago that basically have intersection between humanities and computer science. But before that, I think let me just tell you a little bit about this episode. This is the third episode in this series, and I'm thrilled to introduce Crisol, that I have been working with her and admire her for many, many years, not only as a passionate human being, but also as one of the hardcore philosophers I mentioned, um, specifically analytical philosophy that I know, because we can talk about philosophers in many different aspects, but she has been working in problems that requires some understanding in science. So one of the most originally, and I can tell her, I can always tell her, that is one of the most brilliant minds that I ever met, that have the chance to that I had the chance to meet her when I was a student. Then we were classmates, and eventually we become instructors and professors in the college. So I have the opportunity to working with her in different capacities. So Crisol and I, we met in the Center for Science and Technology in Engineering and Policy. This was in UTEP in 2006. And both of us, we were research assistants in the Institute working in problems in ethics and computing. So back in the day, we were called cyber ethics. There was already something in place in the ideas of cyber ethics, but again, the idea of cyber was a little bit gray area there. So also ethics, by the way. So she was working on her master's in arts and philosophy. I was doing my master's in science and computer science. And we were talking this before with Jules Simons, and I was working with Steve Roach, and Monica is here, who we talk about Steve Roach all the time. So great instructors, great mentors. So back in the day, we were working in aspects in formalisms on privacy, transparency, and ethical theories, and the impact of computing in these days. So we talk about totalitarianism, the correlation and contrast of applications of today's real world areas, in particular in computer science, analytical philosophy. So later on, we work in different problems, not only in this institute, but in 2008, we have a basic philosophical issue. We took a course together, and that's where we talk about more in computing aspects, and the impact of computing and mind. And in 2016, we gave a talk at EPCC that relates similar to this topic. She organized this. It was called Consciousness. I forgot the title, but she can tell us about a little bit later on. But it was something very similar. She started this back in 2016. And we decided to break this whole podcast in 3 parts because it's too much information that we're going to cover. We try to cover. So at least we have 3 main areas that we want to share. And today is basically just a slightly introduction to artificial intelligence and society and how this being impact. So I want to thank Crisol. Thank you, Crisol. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. As Christian said, he and I have been working together for quite some time now, and one of the areas of interest that we've done presentations on is this consciousness and what is it. And especially right now, there's a lot of advancements in technology, and there's also a lot of programs that are, very popular. They're science fiction, but there's a lot of themes related to ethics and notions of personhood and consciousness. And that's what I will be talking about today. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Christian, for inviting me, for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. So thank you so much for being here. So let us just start to discuss. Crisol has a PowerPoint or as a presentation that she will present, but I did a little research, or I update my research that regarding the aspect of consciousness, and I found that consciousness is an individual state of awareness of their environment, thoughts, feelings, or sensations. In order to experience consciousness, one must be both awake and aware. And at the same time, this definition might have different perspectives, as I mentioned, in the area of neuroscience, medicine, computer science, psychology, and of course, philosophy. I understand that some of our listeners might come from different contexts and or in different areas. As a matter of fact, I can tell right now, in at least here in the chat that we have different context, different disciplines who have joined us. So how can we locate at this point, or give us a pivot where we can start discussing this topic for today, Crisol? How can we start? How can we locate ourselves?
Well, this theme of consciousness is big, and you can approach it from many different perspectives. Usually, there's questions about how we can even come to understand what consciousness is and what gives rise to consciousness. So we can approach this from a neuropsychological perspective, um, and there is a lot of work being done in that. Like, a lot of research telling us, okay, what parts of the brain are connected with certain functions, but that's not what I want to focus on today. So my focus in this presentation is, of course, to talk about consciousness, but in terms of notions of personhood. So then I'm going to be using a little bit of what I have on the PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to come back so we can chat some more, and then I'll continue with the PowerPoint, so that way I cover all the different points in the PowerPoint, as well as have this like naturally evolving conversation. So I'd like to focus on the issues of personhood, and then I want to go ahead and talk about how consciousness is connected to notions of personhood. And I think that would be very important in rounding everything up and talking about some of the issues and problems that we face when it comes to being able to program consciousness into an AI agent. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation with you all, just a couple of slides before I get into notions of consciousness. That way we can see kind of like the underlying theme here. So then just give me a second so I can do this. And is it showing?
I can see yes.
Okay.
Everybody can see this. Just in the chat, just tell me if you can see. Okay, perfect. Thank you for the feedback.
So again, this is what I will be centering on, notions of personhood. And then after that, I am going to talk about the different components of consciousness. And then we're going to be talking about the ethical ramifications of computing consciousness. I have a little meme here of a computer who's actually training itself to be a human. And I know that this seems kind of comical, and I know we do play around with the idea of having AI agents that look like humans, talk like humans. But then the deep question here are, like I said, questions about or issues related to personhood. And it all starts with the realization of what it means for us to say that we are people. We usually take the term to mean human and we use it as if they were the same thing, but that can be problematic, right? Let's see here. The whole issue of personhood and how it could be programmed into a machine is very, very old. So then when we think of computer science and we also think of the new technological advances, we think of the 21st century, but the idea has existed from way before. So then back in well, you can see the dates there. I'm going to talk about a philosopher by the name of Descartes, who back in the, let's say, 1600s, was talking about notions of personhood, what is the mind, what is consciousness, and if it's something that is, the same as, or something that is embodied, or if it's something that can exist on its own. And then the idea was placed of whether it would be possible for machines. I mean, back then they didn't have the complicated machines we have today, but they did have notions of what machines were. And the idea came from not just Descartes, but many other thinkers, of whether it would be possible to program machines to act like people, to maybe even look like people, and if that would be enough to classify them as people. So I have a very interesting quote here that was written in 1637, just to give you an idea of how old this concept is, from Descartes' Discourse on the Method. If there were machines which bore a resemblance to our bodies and imitated our actions as closely as possible for all practical purpose, we should still have to vary certain means of recognizing that they were not real men. So from this quote, we get a sense that there was a lot of kind of like a negative reaction against the idea that it would be possible for us to classify machines as human. A lot of people started coming up with justifications as to why they would not be considered a person, even though they could partake in the various different functions. And I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. One of the many different arguments proposed of why machines would not count as people is because there are three different properties that are necessary in order for a machine to be considered someone or some being that has consciousness. In order for machines to be considered people, they need to, of course, know, that they are thinking beings. They need to have some form of self-consciousness. They need to have the capacity for desires and emotions. And because of this, again, I'll talk about this some more later on, the idea came that the machines, even if they could have the capacity for desires and emotions and self-consciousness, we wouldn't be able to know that. Only machines themselves could, because of this idea that we would only be able to see the outside behavior and we wouldn't be able to capture the experiential knowledge that the machine was getting or creating. So because of that, it was basically believed for a while that even if we could program them, they wouldn't count quite as people. And I'm not going to read the whole quote here because it's pretty long, but basically he was saying, look, there's more to human or being human than just having the capacity to express themselves. You know, that is very apparent today because we have all sorts of toys and machines that can perform functions that look like they're consciously aware, but they really aren't. But in order for us to say that we have consciousness and we are people, we need to have the ability to write a sonnet, like the quote says, or be able to express grief, emotions, pleasure, be able to feel guilt when we make mistakes. And the idea back then was that that was not possible. not only that, but we need to realize that personhood is a complicated thing. Again, we come to think that just because we are human, that necessarily means that we are people, but that is not the case. When we talk about human, we talk about a biological entity. So then, in order for us to say we're human, we could say things like, well, you must have human DNA. But a person is different. A person is a social construct, a social entity. So then, even though someone could be biologically human, that does not mean that they are a person. And again, it gets confusing because we're used to using the words as if it meant the same thing. A very morbid example that I always give my students is to imagine a corpse. So, a corpse we know is human. We know that, but there's something missing in the corpse that doesn't classify the corpse as something like a person with rights. So think about the things that we do to corpses that we would not be able to do to a living being. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's just a very simple example to get you to think about this difference between being a human and being a person, and how just because you are human, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are a person. There are many different properties that you must comply with in order for some being to be considered a person. Uh, and some of the properties listed by a philosopher by the name of Marianne Warren are these consciousness, self-motivated activity, the ability to reason, the capacity to communicate, the presence of self-concepts, and self-awareness. So then she's not writing from sort of like the same thing we're writing or we're talking about here. She's not approaching this from a technological kind of sense. She's actually arguing for abortion and saying that, well, we need to consider whether a fetus who is obviously human might not necessarily meet the requirements for personhood. So I'm taking this a little bit out of context, just letting you know that. But what she does have to kind of contribute to this discussion here are just the notions of what kind of property a being must have in order to be considered a person. Now, nowadays we do have a lot of advances, like I keep saying, and I don't know if you've seen videos. I have some links that I share in my presentation of the different types of robots that they have now and how human they look, and it seems like they can partake in some of these, um, and if what is required for someone to be considered a person is to be able to at least have some of these properties, then it would be possible, unlike what Descartes said centuries ago, for someone who is not human to be considered a person. And that's huge because, again, normally we take those to mean the same thing. But now, because of all of this, and because of all the advancements we had over the last 500 years, we've come to realize that if what makes us people are these properties, not necessarily our DNA, because that's just what makes us human, then we can build and program something that would classify as a person. And that's the context I want to talk about consciousness, because consciousness happens to be one of those properties for personhood. So I'm going to go ahead and, because I've talked enough, go back to Christian so that he can lead us into the next section. Sorry.
Sure. And just a couple things there. Let me see if you can see me. Oh, so one of the things that we were discussing, since we have a couple of computer scientists here, and she mentioned about the aspect, well, of what can be programmable or not, but she mentioned 5 of those main main properties. Wanted to ask if the current people who are right here in the chat or connected, they have a notion of how what's your perspective on how to program this as those 5 properties? Crisol, is that what you wanted to tell, or you want to tell me about the comments that I told you?
Well, we can talk about both if you want. Um, I'd be happy to answer questions about personhood before I move on to notions of consciousness. Um, but it would be interesting to note here. Okay, well, can we program those? How can we program those? And those are concerns that I will be finishing the presentation with. So then I'll have more to say about that as we go.
Okay, so for those participants who we have right here, do you have any initiative to mention how to program those and how to start to doing some kind of programming, if it's any programming? I know a couple of you use just might say a bunch of if-else statements, which is not, it's not completely false, but how do we program this aspect in terms of computing aspect in artificial, before going to artificial intelligence, but those aspects? Let me see. We're gonna wait a couple of seconds, I guess, in the chat to see what's the main initiative.
Okay.
Yes, this definitely touch into machine learning. That's what I'm receiving. Thank you. So I receive a message says that this touches in machine learning, allowing the code that mimic personness. I think that's a very good comment.
I think I'm seeing the comment.
She's this. You can put it also in the public if you want to. They said that's okay if you send it to me privately. But you want to put it here publicly? That's fine. That's fine. Don't worry. Okay, we have allowing to self-learning. I think Monica mentioned. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, you can send 2 types of message, privately or to the public. If you want to send it publicly, that's fine. Can you please, do you mind to resend it? Well, some people have discussed the concept of machine learning, which is an emerging because this has been here for a while area. And Crisol, I'm not so sure if you want to talk about this later on, or you want me to elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I think it would be a good way for me to section into the next part of my PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect.
So yeah, like if you want to talk about that, like I would like that.
Perfect. That's fine. We'll wait. I like this statement, allowing the code that can mimic personness. And this is why we're here, right? We want to have that in mind. Okay. Thank you for those comments. Appreciate that. Okay, someone is mentioned the AI Sophia. I think I heard about that one later on. Before, I have heard that before. Have you heard about that one, Crisol?
And I think at the end I provide links to 3 YouTube videos, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I included a link to AI Sophia.
Good. So we receive a couple of good answers. I'm sorry.
I think, I'm not sure. But I like the comment here, how she was granted citizenship, because that in itself is another messy issue of what constitutes as a citizen, what kind of properties what must we have to be considered a citizen. But there's all sorts of questions that pop up once we start being able to, program and get those sort of agents to be more and more like human.
So this notion of agents is, are we going to discuss this later on? To be an agent?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
To some extent, not to the full extent, because agency is, in philosophy, we take terms like that, agency, that seem very simple to define, and then we just, I don't know, make it overly complicated, some people will say, because we come up with all these different kind of answers, and we break it down too much, I guess. But yeah, definitely, we're going to be talking about some issues of agency.
Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and, you want to continue, or you want me to talk about the comments that I sent you?
It's up to you.
I guess I'm going to wait a little bit more.
Okay.
So you want to go ahead and do the rest of the presentation that you have?
Okay. All right. So I shared with you some of the context. I wanted you to kind of like get a sense of what the underlining theme here is, which of course I said was personhood. But just to remind you, one of those properties is consciousness. So then I'm going to talk about consciousness now and the different approaches to what is consciousness. So let me go ahead and share my presentation once more. And so from the beginning, so I'm just going to scroll through it. Okay, so then let's talk about the problem of being able to define and map consciousness. So then, once again, we speak of the word as if it was just one simple thing, but consciousness is actually very complicated. And it is not just a complicated thing for philosophers, as I joked about earlier, but even people like neuroscientists are having a hard time trying to define and explain what consciousness is. So there are three questions I want to focus on when it comes to consciousness. And one of those is the features of consciousness. Then I want to talk about how consciousness can exist, and then why does it exist? So these are the three main questions that we address when we talk about consciousness in philosophy, which are different from the type of questions you would address if you approached it from another discipline. Hopefully I'll have time to cover all of that, but one of the things that I am going to focus a lot on is the first question, which is the features of consciousness. And I think that's because if we want to learn how to program consciousness, we first need to know what it is. So we need to figure out what it is that we want, a goal, so that way we can take the steps to achieve that goal. So then let's talk about what is consciousness. So then there are different ways to look at consciousness. So one way in which we look at consciousness is when we talk about conscious beings. That's also known as creature consciousness. So there's a person in the broad sense of the word. So remember, person doesn't have to be human, that has the ability to be conscious. Another way to look at consciousness is to talk about conscious states. So there we're not talking about a conscious being anymore. We're talking about particular functions that the brain can perform that would give rise to conscious state. Then there are discussions of consciousness itself, which I'm not going to get into, but these notions don't talk about consciousness happening inside a person. And again, in the broad sense of the word person, but they happen in themselves. So this third approach is more experimental in the sense that it proposes that consciousness can exist outside of objects, and that in fact something as big as a universe can have consciousness, even though the entity of the universe is scattered because there are different objects in the universe. So again, I'm going to concentrate on the first two for this particular presentation. So then let's talk about consciousness in a being, in a person. Well, these then are properties that a being must have in order for us to say that that is a conscious being. To begin with, sentience. So, sentience is the ability to feel pleasure and pain. The faculty of sentience does center on being able to have some sensory experience. So there has to be a way for us to be able to see, to hear, to touch, to taste, and to respond to those feelings. So I think, given the advances that we know of today, there's a lot of, a lot of, well, like there's been a lot of improvement when it comes to sentience. Uh, Another one is wakefulness, and that's something that Christian already talked about when he introduced the notion of consciousness. So we need to be awake, we need to be alert in order for us to have consciousness. So, for example, the example I used before of a corpse, right? The corpse doesn't have consciousness because it's no longer alert, it's no longer awake. Now, the next one, self-consciousness. This involves meta-awareness. So in order for, and this is the meta part, in order for a person or a being to have consciousness, they need to have the ability to recognize the fact that they have consciousness. So if a being is just conscious and they're not aware of that consciousness, then paradoxically, they're not conscious. I know that's kind of weird, but there needs to be a recognition that the person is a conscious being. So then there's that element of self-reflection. And that could be a little problematic to gauge. Remember what I said at the beginning of the presentation when I talked about Descartes? Well, even if you had an AI agent who seemed like they were conscious, it would be really hard for us to measure what's really going on unless we had direct access to their ability to reflect on their own state of being. The next one is experiential subjectivity. And this one is also something that is very problematic when it comes to programming, because we can program them to feel, we can program them to react a certain way, but all of those are going to be problematic in the sense that we need something more to capture the experiential knowledge that comes with that. So I'll be talking about that later on. But basically, when we talk about experiential subjectivity, we're talking about something called qualitative experience, what it's like. Another property of creature consciousness would be that you are the subject of the conscious states. So then the capacity to have mental states. Again, here it goes back to this notion of self-reflection, where you do need to be able to have these mental states, but you also need to be able to reflect on the fact that you have them. And finally, another thing that is very important is something called transitive consciousness, which is the ability to project your sense of self into the world. Okay, so that's something usually associated with notions of like creative notions like art, but not just that. That's, one example. But transitive consciousness relies on something called intentionality. So intentionality is this ability to be able to see something in the world and project something like a system of values to that object. So think about when you go shopping, something very simple, right? The store is full of all these items. So say, for example, you go into a clothing store and you're looking for a shirt or a blouse, and you go into the store. There's all these objects. In order for there to be intentionality, there needs to be something in you as a person, as a being, that is attracted to a particular blouse or shirt as opposed to others. So the fact that you go for, say, a black shirt as opposed to a red one, that demonstrates some form of intentionality, because it's a way for you to be able to interact with your environment in a way that your sense of self gets demonstrated through your actions. Now, let's move on. Or I don't know, Christian, is this a good place to stop, or should I just move on to state consciousness?
I think it's, I haven't received any any actually questions that we have in the chat. But do you mind going a little bit to the previous slide? Because
Okay.
when we discuss about programming, I just want to let my speakers know that you probably were thinking the same way we think in computer science. When we want to program, how do we extract these characteristics that we can put it in a programming language, in a context, in a virtual environment, or whatever? Some of you mentioned the um, machine learning and other engines that can help us. And I want you to at least to consider this notion of these characteristics per se, that current technology and current algorithms that we have, we are in the process to basically formalize this because we have sensors. We have these notions to be awake and alert and consider us in a context, in a static context, or in a dynamic context as well, in terms when we deal with these issues in terms of environment variables, or when we have contextualization variables. So those are the same principles that we learn in the foundations of computer programming, without seeing that there is going to be an impact on this later on. So I just wanted to try to reflect or try to contextualize the concepts that we have learned in our field of computer science to apply to these problems. And as she mentioned, these are not new problems. I mean, now we can see that because everything, or your car has sensors, your cell phone has sensors, but these are problems that they've been for many years in humanity. So I just wanted to understand this contextualization, and I just want to mention that at this point. Crisol, you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay. And just to add to that, the notion of agency is connected to notions of intentionality. Um, because intentionality, like I said, uh, is a way for individual in their environment to interact and make choices in a way that it projects their sense of self. So that's one of the concepts that is going to be very important when we talk about agency. Okay, so then I'm going to move on to state consciousness. So then this, remember, is not talking about a particular being and whether they're conscious or not. We're talking about those states that they have. So those mental states that can be programmed, or we can aim at programming for us to say that the being is then able to have some form of consciousness. Some of these are going to seem very repetitive because there's a connection between what I'm about to talk about, or what I'm about to talk, and then also what I previously talked about. So then I mentioned notions of intentional state. So then there's something called meta-intentional states. So then here, kind of like what we talked about with being aware that you are conscious, it's something similar here. You have to be aware that you have intentional states. So then you have to be aware of your own mental states in order for us to say that you are a conscious, or you have conscious states. The next one, qualitative states, that's something that we already talked about when we talked about what does it feel like, the experiential part. So it's the same thing here. In order for us to say that a being is conscious, it has conscious states, they have to be qualitative to some extent. So here we're talking about this raw sensory experience of being able to feel in the moment. Then to build on those are the phenomenal states. So then this is where experience gets a little bit more complicated because we start adding notions of structural, I want to say the word structural values to our experience. So we conceptualize what we are, experiencing. It's not just, you know, touching a teddy bear and making or noticing that it feels soft. It's not just the raw sensation here. It comes with a lot of baggage, like a lot of thoughts that come with that experience, and the way that we organize and structure reality according to those experiences. The experiential states, those are connected to the qualitative states, as I already mentioned. These are the what it's like. So we talked about those before. with the notion of conscious beings. But here, with the experiential states, what we need to do is understand the internal conception that goes in the being that gives rise to this. So then the person, the conscious person, in order to have conscious states, they need to be able to approach the world from a first person view. So then they don't conceptualize the world as something foreign to them. They recognize their agency and all of this as the person that's experiencing. So then that goes back to notions of agency as well to notions of personhood that we talked about earlier. Another property would be access to consciousness itself. So, inside our head, we form all these mental relationships. Uh, we have these structures that we use in order to function through our daily lives, but we also understand that everything doesn't happen the same way. So we need to be able to be flexible and adapt to changing environments. That's something that would give us state consciousness. So, for example, you have certain expectations of what reality is going to be like. So, say you're going to work and you leave on with plenty of time so that you get there, and you're there driving, and all of a sudden as you're going through driving on the freeway, you notice that all the traffic starts stopping. Maybe there's been a really bad accident and that's slowing everything down. Well, if you don't have the ability to understand that even though that was your plan, you can kind of get away from that, make alternative plans, like maybe get off the freeway, take the side road so that you get to where you need to get. So if you don't have that flexibility of mind to kind of make real world decisions and adapt your structures, your relationships that you formed in your head, then you wouldn't be technically someone who has state consciousness. And then finally, there's narrative consciousness. So in order for us to say that a person or a being is experiencing a state of consciousness, they need to be able to partake in what is called the stream of consciousness. Basically, the idea that there's a flow to your thoughts, that they're not disconnected. And that's crucial for notions of identity and agency, because imagine if all of a sudden you look around you and you don't know where what you did to get there. So say, for example, you were in your home, you were relaxing, and the next thing you know, you're at the supermarket and you don't know how you got there. Right? So if there is not that connection between your activity, then that is going to affect your notions of identity and personhood, and also your sense of consciousness. And I know that there's people who have had really bad accidents that damage certain part of their brain, that they're not able to link those experiences together. So then the notion of consciousness requires that we do have the capacity to link those things together.
I have a question. When now that you mentioned about when people have some kind of trauma or a bad accident, a very bad accident, there's always this conversation. There's like, why don't you remember? Okay, how get I here, right? So it's more common than you think. When you have a trauma, something goes into your consciousness and basically disconnects that part. Is that what you mean with the narrative consciousness, Crisol?
That's one part, yes. Because think about how our identities and personhoods are constructed based on our memories. Every time you see your parents, every time you see a loved one, uh, you recognize them as somebody that you've known because of those memories, and that allows you to have a coherent sense of self. But if there is a damage to the brain that does not allow you to recognize them as that, then it doesn't form part of your identity anymore. Another example that I can give, a very simple example, is just people who sleepwalk. There's people who can have conversations depending on the level of sleepwalking there. Uh, not very coherent conversations, but they can have conversations. There's people who can do other things. I used to know a person who would go and cook as they were sleepwalking. And then when they would wake up, they didn't have any memory of that happening, so it doesn't integrate into their sense of self in the same way as an experience where you do have that stream of consciousness.
Interesting. Interesting. And thank you for elaborating that. And regarding the phenomenal state, you mentioned about spatial and temporal. Can you please tell us a little bit? Is that the notion of where you're located in time, or the place? Is that what is referring to the phenomenal state?
Yes, and not just you, but other objects as well.
Okay.
So then, I kind of mentioned this with the going to the groceries example, right, or the store,
Mm-hmm.
that you need to be able to have a conceptualization and organization of your surroundings in order for you to be able to move through things. And if you lose that, then you lose a big part of what it means to have a conscious state. Just think, and to us, it seems very simple, but just think of all the different things that need to happen in order for you to be able to get out of bed and go to the kitchen to make yourself something to eat. You need to visualize, where your surroundings are, right? Where's your bed? Is there anything that's going to get in the way? Where's the door? And if there's not a way to conceptualize that, and to have all that information organized, is going to be very difficult for you to get to one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very crucial, because the notion that we can move through the world around us allows us to have these experiences that can then be incorporated into our sense of personhood and self.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm gonna give a comment. Maybe later on you can answer it to me, because there is a horrible series called Black Mirror, and I think I already mentioned that in the past. It's horrible because unfortunately we are living in very similar aspects like that, and they touch a couple of in different episodes. They talk about consciousness in certain ways. They have this ability in the future. Well, they want to mention, if you haven't look at those, don't look at those. But at the same time, try to look at it with a different perspective now that we understand this concept. But they were able to extract the consciousness of individuals and put it in something called cookies, which basically eventually they can live there for years, right? But it's only the conscious. And you talk about distinguish between a corpse that you can just don't have any lack of consciousness, but at the same time they were able to extract that information, which is called the consciousness, and put it and locate it in a cookie, or in eventually into a teddy bear or things like that. So it's kind of interesting to see that perspective. I'm going to mention that maybe in a little while, or you probably have some information on that later on. So I know this is slide 13, so I think you still have more information on that, but I think it relates to this, no?
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that, with the teddy bear, I've seen that episode too. I like that series. It has a
Mhm.
lot of food for thought. Um, is the fact that, well, is it ethical to be able to program consciousness in something that has a very limited amount of motion? Just because of what I said before, right? That in order for us to be able to interact with the world, to be able to form new experiences, to be able to learn and grow as people, we need to have that ability to kind of expand our horizons, be able to move through different environments and have that sense of adaptability, that flexibility, as well.
Mhm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Are you able to see the screen again? Or
Yes, I'm.
yeah.
Can everybody?
All right. So then, what are the components of consciousness? So what is it that we need to worry, or we need to be able to do in order for us to be able to, program consciousness? Well, we need to have a way to program points of view. We need to be able to have the flexibility to be able to understand the world from a first person narrative, a second person, and even a third person narrative. So that ability to, or that flexibility of mind to switch from those, points of view when it comes to our narrative, the way that we kind of make a story of the reality around us is something that is crucial. We do need to have the experiential subjectivity, the what it's like. That's something crucial as well. There's also the qualitative character, the raw feeling of it that we need to take care of. And we also need to be able to, and again, this is kind of repetitive. It's kind of like a mixture of the other two parts of my presentation. We need to be able to order and structure experience, because without that, then that's going to go ahead and complicate our sense of self. We need to be able to have a sense of when things happen, where they happen, if one thing led to another, so that we come to understand the body that we have in relation to the world around us. Time is a very important one, because think about what would happen if our sense of time was off. Like, for example, if you got up in the morning, and then you went to the kitchen to have breakfast, okay, imagine what reality for you would be like if it didn't follow a sequence of causal relationships. If one moment you were in your bed, the next moment you were in the kitchen, the next moment you were in the hallway, and you don't have that nice flow to it. So then, we talked about phenomenal structure before, but that's something that we need to take care of. Then we need to talk about self um, coherence, right? We need to be able to have an integrated sense of self. So then our perspectives of who we are and how we deal with the world around us is complicated. Uh, and if we don't have a way to be able to uh, put everything together in a coherent way, then that's going to affect the state of consciousness we have. And then again, these are leading one to the other. So then we move on to unity. Okay, if we have fragmented senses of self, we're not going to be able to have or be a conscious being in the same way. So we need to be able to account for our identity through time. And that is something related to focused agency. So again, we keep talking about agency, right? If you don't have a sense of identity of self through time, then your agency is not going to be focused. I gave you the example of your experiences just being all over the place, right? So your sense of agency won't be or will be diminished if you don't have a sense of identity, if you don't have a sense of self. Okay. We talked about intentionality before, and transparency as well. Okay, so transparency has to deal with the clarity in which we come to understand our surroundings. And there has to be a dynamic flow in these experiences in order for us to say that we have consciousness or we're conscious beings. We need to have the ability to self-create. And I know that's something that was mentioned earlier on in the comments, right? Which is also tied to learning, self-organizing. And then we also talked about the stream of consciousness. So then those are the various components that we need to take into account, among more, in order for us to be able to look at what it would mean for someone to be a conscious being. And this then gets complicated because there's still a lot of questions of whether consciousness is something that is a function of the brain, if it's something that can be reduced to particular events that happen in the brain, or if consciousness is an emergent property that uh, we wouldn't be able to recreate. So there's a lot of questions here, not just about what consciousness is, but how consciousness comes to be, that can pose some issues when it comes to programming or computing consciousness. Um, do we need a pause?
I think we're good. I think we're good. I just want to mention here, again, I'm going to bring a couple of different aspects that I've been watching Netflix a lot. And one of the things that you mentioned in the other slide, it's about this raw feeling. And can you please go back a little bit? Just I wanted to elaborate a little bit that, and excuse me, So I know you mentioned you talked to me about Westworld. You want to talk about Westworld later on, or you want me to just give a comment about here that I found?
You can do that, and then I can just add to that.
Yeah, because if you haven't watched Westworld, there's I think there's a series in HBO, I think so, but you can find it somewhere else. I'm not so sure where, but it took my attention when a kid told the main character, "You're not real," and another person, probably the mastermind, tells to the character, "Do you know who you are?" And then she responds that she's in a dream, and the person responded, "You are in my dream." So I think this is the connection that you want to do in computing consciousness, because now you can someone, maybe the individual, has full control of the scenario and the entire world where these characters are living it. And people may talk about simulations, for example, which can be another different uh, conversation, because simulations are very useful in order to predict um, possible outcomes that we can have in the future. If you have a lot of data, just put it in the program and you can simulate it how that data is going to behave in that particular context, and then you can extract based on probabilistic situations, and you can say, yeah, you know what, we have this percentage of certainty that this will happen. And I think there's going to be a connection, a strong connection between the computing consciousness that we can have, that we can emulate the possible outcomes that they can have. But I like that slide that you mentioned there, because I think that will touch a couple of those points when we arrive to computing consciousness. Maybe.
Yes, because one of the things would be for us to have structures in our minds, but also the flexibility to account for things not going the way that we had anticipated. So then the more information we can include, the various paths we can program, so that way, there's that flexibility that is needed in order for us to talk about conscious states.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about intentionality later on, or you're done with the intentionality and
I'm
autonomy?
done. I'm going to be mentioning a lot of those other aspects in
Mhm.
context of ethics.
Perfect.
Um, so then, like, I will be talking about that later
Okay.
on. Shall I continue,
Yes,
or
please. Yes. There's one thing that you want me to elaborate, or you?
I think once we talk about where we're at,
Uh-huh.
then that it would be nice for you to elaborate on that.
All right, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so then almost done. I just want to go ahead, and I don't know if you all are gonna have access to this. I know it's been an hour already, and I don't want to keep too long. So I don't know how much time we have, but there are some links here to examples of what have been done in terms of being able to compute AI agents or close to that, that I wanted to provide. I don't know if we could
Mhm.
see them, but maybe if we have time at the end, we can come back to those. But just to kind of give you a sense of how close are we, or if that's a question that makes sense to getting to where we might want to be. Um, but I want to finish off with some important considerations that we do need to take into account, because oftentimes when we talk about the evolution of technology, we have a tendency to say, okay, well, let's push the limit, let's do this, let's do that, let's advance. And sometimes ethical questions kind of get left to the side, pushed aside, and then we end up with problems in the future that we could have anticipated and corrected for early on. So that's how I would like to end my part of the presentation before we discuss this. And just some important considerations that we do need to take into account when it comes to the step of being able to compute artificial intelligence. One of those that I do want to talk about is how we or our conceptions of knowledge. So we take knowledge to be facts, just facts. So then when computing, or when, just saying that we have information or knowledge, we focus on just, is this, how can we go ahead and classify this? Is this true? Is this false? But that's just one type of knowledge. That's propositional knowledge. That's what we would call propositional knowledge. So then you can program, say, or you can come up with a program with a bunch of information, a bunch of facts, and that would only cover one type of knowledge. So then, in order for us to be able to talk about machine learning, machine thinking, we also need to take into account, and I'm pretty sure you do, is the experiential part. Remember, we keep talking about not just qualitative experience, but also the experiential subjectivity, the what it's like. And that's a little harder to compute because there's a personal element there. There has to be some form of agency to go ahead and make that knowledge or incorporate that knowledge into being a being. Um, Ethics, for example, is something that we there's a lot of shows that talk about, okay, ethical treatment, not just of AI agents, but also, is it possible for them to be ethical? And ethics is not something that you can get at with just propositional knowledge. So ethics is not a field that consists of just knowing facts. Uh, it's more complicated than that, because with ethics, there's a prescriptive element that is not captured with just the facts alone. Another thing that we need to consider here is, how do we capture human experience? And that will tie into the goal that we have. But we know, for example, and I just mentioned this, that programming facts or information is not going to be enough, because there's something about human experiences or experience that sometimes facts get in the way. And I haven't seen a lot of research when it comes to this point, and that's a personal interest of mine, on how to be able to capture the essence of human experience. And I'll say a little bit about that at the end of my presentation, because I want to finish it with a quote that relates to this. And basically, it's the realization that just because something is a fact, that doesn't make it true. And I know that's very controversial, because usually when we think of facts, we think of claims that are known to be true. But again, I'll say more about that in just a second. Another thing that we do need to consider here is our human nature. And I think shows like Westworld and Black Mirror do a great job at not just incorporating ethics and technology and the use of technology, but also to make us question what it means for us to be human, and what is in our human nature that could end up being problematic if we try to mimic human nature when computing AI agents. In other words, and I know it's going to sound crude, but why should we be using human as a standard? And I think that's something that is very relevant right now with how things are going around us in the world. But think about it like this: why would you want to program more people that behave like humans? And not all humans, because I'm not saying all humans are bad, but that's something to consider. Okay, I know, talking about things with Christian, I know that there's certain things that get, you know, that need to be taken into consideration. And when it comes to creation of AI agents, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to program them to be exactly like human. And the question here, or the issue here, is like, well, why would we want to? Humans are capable of doing really great things, but they're also capable of doing really bad things. And again, bringing back Black Mirror and Westworld, okay, a lot of issues come about not because of the lack of being able to program, or the inability to be able to program AI agents. It's more like, okay, what happens, what we as humans do to give rise to these problems. And that leads to the ethical issues that we do need to consider. One of the things is, okay, well, I know that there's this movement towards wanting to improve and get better and take things to the next level, but do we need to consider the limitations of that? And I think we do, but those are kind of open-ended questions that I would like you all to think about. Okay, should we do it? Do we have to program, or do we have to keep pushing for the programming of artificial intelligence so we can have AI agents? And if the answer is yes, I think it's very important for us to have a goal in mind. Like, why are we doing that? Do we want agents just so that they can carry out the tasks that we don't want to do? And if that is the case, if the reason why I want an AI agent is so that they can go into a very dangerous mine and get materials out so that a human life would not be lost, then we start getting into issues of, okay, well, if you're programming them to be conscious, to be beings that deserve the title of personhood, then we get into notions of, well, do they deserve rights? If they are people, then we should be not only granting them moral agency, but also granting them moral consideration. And that's something that, again, shows like Black Mirror and Westworld are really great about, when it comes to showing the importance of that. I mean, you want to program an agent, an AI agent, to be able to carry out these conscious activities that a human can. But the fact that, at the same time, we kind of want to strip away rights and ethical treatment of them is very, something that's worth considering. And at the beginning of the session, there was a person who mentioned AI Sophia and how she has citizenship now. Well, those are considerations that we need to take into account as well. Like, well, what kind of treatment um, do they deserve? And would we be justified in just doing things with them that we wouldn't do with a human? And I'm going to end my presentation. There's room for discussion here with a quote from a novel by Tim O'Brien called The Things They Carried. And again, the novel here is not about AI, not a sci-fi novel. It's actually something close to a memoir of what a character went through when he went through the Vietnam War. So it's a war novel. But there's something very interesting that he says in this novel that sparked a lot of interest. And that's where I hope that in the future I can do more research on. And that goes back to what I said, right? That just because something happens to be a fact, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And this quote nicely sums that up. I think a thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. So let me give you a little bit of context here. This person who went to war is talking about his experiences in the Vietnam War, and he has this platoon, and he's describing how some of the members in his platoon got horribly injured or even killed. And one of those stories relates to two people in his platoon who were walking, investigating, and they had a game, and the game was to throw a grenade. I know maybe not a good game to play, but that's what they did. And when one of them throws, I think it was a grenade, okay, throws it, he steps into a mine. And it was just something, very simple. That had great ramifications because then he blew up. It's kind of morbid. But the point that Tim O'Brien is making in this novel is that if he were to just tell the story based on the facts, it would be missing a key component, which is the experience that I kind of keep talking about in the presentation, and how sometimes facts are not enough to capture that experience. So when he tells the story, Tim O'Brien is saying, he exaggerates what happens. He makes it more dramatic because he says, the only way for me to capture what I felt in the moment, the experience of what was going on in that moment, was not to program the facts, or to talk about the facts, sorry, it was to exaggerate them, because it is in the exaggeration that we're going to be able to get a sense of the experience. And I thought that was very mind-blowing, because usually when we approach this, we also want, we approach it from that angle. Okay, let's be as accurate in representing how things are. But sometimes experience, in human experience, uh, cannot be captured by those facts, and you need an element of exaggeration to capture or to get a sense of the truth. And hopefully I'll have time to do more research in the future on that. But that's all I want to say. That's my presentation.
Yeah, I think that part it just mind blowing me as well, because it's interesting to see the notion, or not necessarily the conjunction of facts and truth at the same part, and the component of exaggeration. I think that's what links a lot of different things as a human part. Something that caught my attention, Crisol, and I go to, I try to go to DEF CON, which is the conference for, or this, it's it's a gathering, right, from all the hackers in the world. It's in Vegas. It got canceled this year because of the circumstances that we're living in. But in DEF CON, I have attended a couple years to this, and there is different sections and different tracks. And this was not true a long time ago. Now there is a track that is human hacking, right? Is trying to understand why humans are the way, or they behave the way are behaving, understanding the context on computing. Because it's interesting that you mentioned about the rights and the ethical considerations when you develop a new software, or when you develop a new program, or a plug-in to a machine learning aspect or whatnot. Why you have to consider the human factor. If the human factor not necessarily is perfect, as a matter of fact, we're far beyond of perfect. You have a set of rules, you put it in the computer basically follows those rules, end of story. So in humans, we're not like that. In humans, we're malfunctioning per se, because there's many different things now. And one of the tracks that they're doing is trying to understand, try to hack the human, understand why he's acting that way, but in the perspective of computing, rather to have in the psychological point of view. Of course, there's people from psychology and anthropology and philosophy that they go there and try to give their point of view. There's also a track of ethics, and that's where you bring why you should not program machines to go to war instead of just soldiers, right? And but because that you have to train the machine to basically go and defeat the enemy, right? But there's a lot of there's a convention, and there is a couple of countries that they are part of that convention, that yes, we will not program a killing machine. But there's other countries to say, like, why not? And having the human factor into consideration at this point, that gives us a completely different complexity. And you mentioned something about the idea of ethics and how they're not, uh, you cannot follow the proportional logic, because once you try to follow that thing, it will not be true. And that's something that the human experience, if you want to incorporate it into this aspect, then that will fussy or defussify everything. And that's something that we don't want to consider. And I'm very happy that you brought this into the consideration. I just want to mention that, because I think it's super important these days, because everybody's fabricating different kind of software, different kind of apps, different kind of artificial intelligence. You have a data set that you just plug and play into this search engine, and then start to consider that thing based on human experience. And that's not probably necessarily the right thing to do. Is that something related to what you mentioned, Crisol?
Yes, that in our quest as humans to improve, to make everything better from how it is now, we always have to ask ourselves, well, what's the goal behind that? Because sometimes progress for the sake of progress, blind progress, could end up having very bad consequences that then later on create a lot of problems. So then it is that we do need to have that goal. I mean, ethics is a complicated mess. It is. And part of the reason is because it's not descriptive. When it comes to ethical views, it is not so simple as to say, oh, well, this is what people are doing, so this is what must be true. There's an ought component, there's a prescriptive component. Um, One of the things that I teach my students about ethics is that there's a difference between the way that the scientists approach the study of morality from the way that philosophers approach it. Because psychologists and anthropologists can go out there and they can record what people are doing. That's not a problem. But with the philosophical approach to the study of morality, we need to dig a little deeper, because just because people are doing it, that doesn't make it right. So then the difference here is that a normative approach, a prescriptive approach, gives you rules, if you want to call them that, of how you should behave, you ought to behave, which is very different from the description of how we actually do. Think about a doctor. A doctor can look at your x-rays, look at your blood work, and from that be able to go ahead and tell you what you have. But there's also the prescriptive element where he's going to make recommendations on how to be able to deal with your ailment. And there it gets a lot fuzzier, because some of those recommendations might end up harming you. And then you have to go back to the doctor and say, look, this is making me feel really sick. And the doctor has to modify those, make another recommendation. And it's similar with ethics. Ethics is prescriptive in the sense that we're not talking about something that can be quantified in the world in some sense. We're talking about an imposition that we're trying to make on behavior and how things should function, and that's not always as clean as it should, or we have the expectation of how it should be. So then there's a prescriptive element in ethics that we do need to take into consideration. And it's not just blindly doing or following something without thinking of those ramifications.
You mentioned fuzzy. What do you mean with fuzzy? That is not necessarily 0 or 1. It's something in between.
Yeah, like the example of the doctor is really, I think, pertinent here, because with a prescription, right? The doctor says, okay, well, take this medication, and you can take it, but that doesn't mean it's going to work. Sometimes medications do come with a lot of side effects, but every person reacts to medication in a slightly different way. So what works wonders for one person might not work wonders for another. So there's a subjective element there that needs to be considered when it comes to issues of health and what prescriptions work. And it's the same thing with ethics. It's not that well defined in the sense that, okay, well, this is right, this is wrong, and that's it. There's a lot of variables in between that we need to consider, and we need to have the flexibility to be able to account for things not going as prescribed.
It was very interesting that you mentioned that. It's when you deal with, so there's a multiplicity of variables, and there's a lot of things to consider. Of course, some of them, they might play a different roles in the concept. I'm trying to visualize that in an environment that you can actually play with those variables and then actually make operations without making too much conflict. Because in terms of computing, you might have variables that control certain aspects of the software, certain stages and whatnot. But at some point, they're going to try to put together information and then make a decision, for example. And this is one of the problems that we have in computing, that there is a lot of areas that you have a conflict when you're trying to put them together. One of the things that we can see every day is cybersecurity, right? When you have information and every entity has their own information, you want to come here and get closer to a certain area, and then boom, it doesn't let you because you don't have the credentials, you don't have the ranking for do it, you don't have the classification to do it. So that's one of the things that you can consider that in the when there's a conflict. I don't want to talk about more about cybersecurity, but I just want to let you know that that establishment of variables eventually has a conflict when you're trying to make a decision. And in going back to the ethics, the intention that someone has, you talk about the intentionality they have. There is implications for that. One of the things that caught my attention is this notion of second life. I'm not so sure if they still there, but I'm sure there's another kind of software emulations. And Second Life, it's an artificial intelligence um, platform when you create an avatar, and basically it helped a lot of people. And I want to see your perspective on this, because you might say, like, why you want to go to a second life, just live this life? Well, the second life is more perfect for certain people, not only because you can create your own environment, your own earth, exactly what happened in Westworld, but here can assist people who are to have some kind of impediment. For example, maybe people who have Parkinson or have other kind of this kind of impairity, and they live in second life because that gives them happiness. And that's so this connection of reality, but that's for them is their best reality they have right now. I just want to see what's your point of view in that particular context, when someone prefers to live in a virtual environment, in a different reality, rather to in this life. And actually there was another movie, again, let me just bring the movies. I have watched a lot of shows these days, but Inception plays with that or entertains that same concept, when people just go and sleep for a while. If you haven't watched this movie, it's interesting. And you can live there for years sleeping, right? But sleeping can be just a dream. So you have, before you have the REM, you just wake up. But people start to distinguish what was real and what was not real. And you have an artifact to identify if it was a dream or it was not a dream. But people start to see they prefer to live in that virtual environment rather than have live in this world, in this reality. So they prefer an artificial reality rather than the real reality. So I know there's a couple of ethical implications based on that. I just want to see your perspective on this.
Well, before I like to talk about the ethics, I want to talk about that concept in general, because in that question of what is reality is something that we talk about in other branches of philosophy, like metaphysics and also epistemology. So then we have a certain preference to what we call reality. But if we take a look at just human consciousness and existence and what we know of the human brain, we would come to realize that what we call reality might not necessarily be so real. And this is what I mean. Okay, so then we know, for example, that our experience and our sense of reality gets constructed through the information, partly or mostly through information we receive through our senses. But out of all the information that we're constantly getting, sensory information, the brain blocks out a huge amount of it. What it does make it into consciousness, which is connected to perception, because there's a difference between sensation and perception, is filtered through the brain, the mind. So, for example, right now, thinking you all are seeing me and you're hearing me, and you're thinking that that's reality. But if you take a look at how the brain works, we know that the auditory aspect and the visual aspect get processed by different parts of the brain. So the unity of our perception relies on our brain function, and our notions of reality will change if those brain functions change. So we talked previously about damage to certain parts of the brain and how that would alter your sense of self, personhood, consciousness. So now it's the same thing with our constructed realities. So the world that we experience is not the world itself. There's a lot of philosophers like Kant and Descartes who have argued about this for more than 500 years. Your sense of reality is the construction of what your brain has filtered from your environment. So if we go ahead and talk about reality in that sense, that reality in itself, the outside world, could be different from the way that we are perceiving things, then it should give you a sense of the kind of preference we give to something that maybe the reason why we give a lot of weight to begin with is because of the amount of time that we spend in it. There's a philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell who said that basically, and then this ties in well with what you said about simulated reality, is that we're constantly receiving information that can be quantified in terms of zeros and ones in some sense. He didn't say this verbatim, but he did talk about the fact that, you know, when we dream, right, we get to see a different aspect of reality, if we want to still use the word reality to mean something objective. And he said that the only reason why our dream states don't seem as real as our waking states is precisely because of notions of time. We spend more time in this waking state, which makes reality to us seem like something objective, when in reality it is very subjective. But he said if we spend an equal amount of time, then we would not be having this preference. So then back to what you said about the people who spend their time in Second Life, and to them that is their reality. One of the things that I do want to clarify is that there's different notions of reality, and that this sense of objective reality that exists is not the same for everybody, and it could not be, and in some aspects, it might not even be the same as what we are experiencing. And I know there's a lot of models that talk about things like a holographic universe, how reality in itself is very different from how we see it. And the only thing we have access to is just our perceptions of reality, which we take to be real, but that's just a slice of what reality is like. Right. I remember when I was a student at the physics conference, and they were talking about a notion of fuzzy objects, the idea that reality in itself is not as well defined as we perceive it, experience it, that what we have are just fuzzy objects in the world, and that we give shape to those through the way that we interact with them through our minds.
May I have a quick question?
Yes.
Just said, because yeah, so I'm doing some research on self-adaptive system, which pretty much means that you take, for example, mathematical theory, whatever theory pretty much you can imagine. At this moment, I work on some pretty simple things, but the bottom line is that you can pretty much take some piece of mathematics or computer science or whatever you pretty much want, and then use some rules of inference and, well, let this whole thing work by itself. And believe me or not, it works actually. So it is possible. I actually did it. I'm doing this all the time at this moment. It is possible to create certain mathematical statement, scientific statement completely independently and out of human mind. So that pretty much is some kind of parallel universe in some sense. And my question is, do you see any kind of ethical problems here? That's it. This is my.
Okay, so one of the things that I was going to talk about in connection to ethics is, well, okay, so if we take it that there could be, as you said, parallel realities or different realities, then how do we navigate through them? And is there something that stays constant throughout? Russell, the philosopher I mentioned, said, look, doesn't matter what you classify as reality. What matters is the rules that you can use to navigate through that reality, right? And he wasn't just a philosopher, he was a logician. So his vision here is that through a system, a mathematical system, maybe because he was a mathematician as well, or a logical system, that we would be able to formulate rules that would allow us to function regardless of the realities we were talking about. And now tying it to ethics, one of the big robust theories that we have, which is Kant's theory, is a command-driven ethical theory, to where moral acts follow these things called categorical imperatives. These categorical imperatives are set standards, rules that are formulated through the use of reason, and it is these rules that would allow us to act ethically in the world. And for someone like Kant, the consequences weren't really something to consider. For him, we had these rules, these categorical imperatives, and since as autonomous rational beings, we could understand these rules, we could use these rules and function with them regardless of the rules. So I think an interesting question related to this is not necessarily whether it is right to be able to do it. That is a huge question, and it's an important question for sure. But I think a more interesting question would be, what moral rules and obligations do we have regardless of what realities we're in? Whether it be a parallel reality, whether it be a dream reality, or whether it be waking reality, or if it could be a simulated reality such as playing a video game. I know some video games that exist out there, like Grand Theft Auto, for example, allow you to do various things that some people will say it's just a game. I would never do this in real life. I know that there's instances in which people can go and kill and do really crazy things that if they were in this reality, we want to call it that, I mean, they would get, in really big trouble, and there would be very intense moral ramifications. But we say things like, oh, it's just simulated reality, it's just a game. So then moral principles don't necessarily need to apply. And I think one of the ethical questions and ramifications that become important is like, well, should they apply? I mean, if you do certain acts in a video game, does that matter? I mean, is there an ethical connotation to them just because the reality is simulated? And I think the question here is yes, because if, once again, we consider the existence of parallel realities, whether it be in a video game or, what I've already said, then do your ethical standards hold? And is that ethical standard a product of reason? Is it a product of, just rules and commands that you can, operate by? Or is it something that builds who you are, your person, your identity? And I think those are questions that could tie to that. I hope I answered your question.
No. That was very interesting. So if I understand correctly, as long as I stay away from some kind of people's feelings, I don't know, some kind of moral problems, everything should be fine. Because, that's, okay, so the deal is pretty much quite simple. It's, you just create, some scientific, new scientific, let's say, discovery in completely automatic way. The reason for doing that would be it's faster and there are less errors, so there are some benefits. The only problem with that, I guess, because honestly I don't see any problem, but this is the reason why I asked you this question, is that I have no idea what these things actually is going to do. I have no control whatsoever what is going on. When I run these things, it's just run, and I'm just praying that nothing is going to happen. Of course, I'm just intentionally making it a little more scary than it is, because at this moment, this is just, some really simple math problem mostly, or some computer science problem, and there is nothing really dangerous about it. The only things is that, well, this is pretty much some kind of scientific approach which is without control, and this is the only, I think, ethical aspect of that kind of research, and that's why I ask this question. So if I understand correctly, as long as I stay from problems like, I don't know, hurting somebody's feeling, and so everything should be good. So as long as we focus on, I don't know, and this is exactly what I'm doing, some engineering problems and math problems, I don't know, computer science problem, then that seems to be unrelated to ethics. Is this correct or not correct?
Well, there's other ethical considerations like that come with any field, right? Like, okay, what means are you using? Is this something that could potentially lead to its misuse? So, as you said, maybe the ethical questions are not as like obvious as if it would be like, okay, I'm a doctor, which patient should I save, type of thing. But nevertheless, you know, in any field, we do need to take into consideration, you know, the ethics within the field, making sure that whatever it is we're doing and whatever advancements we're proposing, you know, we account for the implications of those in a sense. And I know it's hard to do, but to definitely at least have that conversation so that it's not something that we just do without having a glimpse of where it might go.
I have a comment on this. So, and I'm sorry that I kind of lead this conversation into that area that this is the interesting thing about dealing with philosophy in different areas of that, because something that Crisol and I, we work in the Institute of Policy and Ethics. It was basically we work with engineers and with scientists. Basically, when you go to the workforce, they ask you, here, follow these instructions. If you don't want to do it, someone else will do it, and there's an impact on that in the ethical and the moral obligations and the ethical considerations when you sit down in front of the computer and you're gonna click or you're gonna hit that button that probably might affect many lives, but at the same time does your job. And that's something that is not easy to discuss, because and there's a completely different area to discuss that, and we can actually discuss this in a different session, but very interesting. I also want to apologize to bring the whole of realities. I wanted to make the connection with consciousness, which you answer very nicely, but I know when we deal with metadata, meta areas, or meta locations for in terms of reality and the rules, that's a completely different can of worms for when we start to discuss this aspect. So I want to thank you, Crisol, for explaining that and deviate and actually bring it back to the concept of consciousness. Thank you, Dr. Ponok, also to bring those questions for considerations as well. I think at this point we're out of time for this episode, and I really wanted to thank everybody who stayed here. I think people left, people came back, people got disconnected, and they connected again. So I think that's the great conversation that we established here. As we mentioned at the very beginning, this topic is so extensively, but we wanted to basically introduce at some point this concept. And in the next parts, probably we're going to discuss different areas or different perspectives, more in focus, and we'll continue with the consciousness. And we're going to describe some of those areas or some of those characteristics that Crisol mentioned at the very beginning, and how we're going to elaborate that towards pursuing this. How can we program these characteristics, these aspects, these qualities that we have in consciousness in artificial intelligence, and keep it at balance, which I think that's the most important thing that we need to consider that. Do you agree, Crisol?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I have a comment actually. So what is the real world, what is the real moral place of algorithms used in Facebook or YouTube, that what they to do, or what they do to enhance what is believed and your preferences, putting people in a bubble of close to zero opposition, or let's say contrasting ideas, which this will lead to persons that in some cases have an imbalanced concept of reality. Could we have a better algorithms that present people with better sampling in the real world? I think this is a great question. And Crisol and I, we were discussing this before the podcast, that right now there's big monsters controlling a lot of information, like YouTube, Facebook, Microsoft, Google. So there's these big people who are actually having a lot of data, a lot of information, but everybody has one of this, and everybody has access to those media, either through Facebook, Twitter. And how can people can use this ethically? How can they use this morally? And I think that's a big question right now. And Crisol, this is a very good question. Thank you, Iram, for asking that question, because this is what we're facing right now in the real life. People can just say, look what's happening, and this is my truth, right? And that will bring some kind of implications and consequences for the people who read it and the people who actually publish it, but not necessarily has to be correct. And that's there. We need to understand that there is going to be some kind of validation and verification of the data that we're transmitting and receiving at some point. And I think there is a lot of ethical considerations in the programmers or in the computer scientists that people from philosophy, they've been working for centuries, and to put it here. So every programmer, they should be able to take a couple courses in ethics and consider that. And when the time they program something, a new technology, a new app, a new something, because that will bring a lot of consequences. And we're living it right now as we speak in 2020. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of information that is not clean and is being pre-processed by many of these applications that we'll be using. And of course, they bring a lot of ethical implications. So the lack of ethical knowledge has brought us into this point of humanity, when we right now we confuse, we label things, we hashtag things that we believe belongs to certain things with 100% confidence, and that is not true. And that's something that I want to discuss later on in a different episode. Crisol, do you have something on this?
Well, just kind of following up on what you said already, that um, you know, technology is a tool. If you don't have the ethical know-how or the standards to use it, that tool can be used for good, just like it could be used to do really bad things. And I think that starts with the human element, recognizing that an opinion is not the same thing as a fact. And I talked about this throughout the presentation, right? There's facts. Those facts are different from human experience. Now I'm going to give it a different light, because sometimes a lot of people think that the experience, the experiential aspect of it, imposes truth. And just because you have an opinion or you feel a certain way, that's how reality is. But again, there's that difference. We need to recognize that there is that difference, that experience is exaggerated. Experience is, or to properly capture that experience, there's an element there in which information is going to be misused. We're going to be misguided, and we need to acknowledge that difference. There's a big difference between opinion and fact. And when I talked about constructive realities here, I did not mean a reality based specifically on whatever it is we think or our views about the world. Those subjective interpretations, right? could end up distorting reality for sure, or what we consider to be the objective reality. But it's also the recognition that because we are human and because there's all these flaws in being human, that we have to acknowledge the uncertainty in our own beliefs. And definitely, we need to leave room for opposing views. One of the things that I do in my ethics courses, when it comes to controversial topics, ethical issues like abortion, capital punishment, and the like, is teach them a method that we use in philosophy, that instead of trying to prove something true, we try hard to disprove it. And I'm going to go back to something Socrates said, that as long, or to paraphrase, as long as we are aware of what we don't know, we are going to be better people. I think the moment that we start asserting our opinions and taking them as unquestionable truth is the moment we get into trouble.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That's interesting. That. Thank you so much, Crisol. I want to thank Crisol Escobedo for being in this episode, and I hope to see you again. And we're gonna look forward to working the second episode, the same part that will bring this exciting topic and in the conjunction with artificial intelligence. Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody also who joined us today and who's watching. Please subscribe to the channel and please subscribe to the social media that it will show later on to follow up with the next episodes. Crisol, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you everybody for staying with us.
Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time.